On December 26th, as the night approached, everything looked almost beautiful to civilians. The 3-eye atlas images showed a typical comet, a faint nucleus, a fluffy coma, and a thin tail. The news feeds were already labeled Rare Visitor, Don't Miss It. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in a windowless room that always smells of air conditioning and hot plastic, no one calls a comet that. They call it a target. And the problem is, a target doesn't behave like a dust cloud. The first numbers arrived not as a sensation, but as an annoying glitch. The radar operator sees a stable reflection at a distance where the comet should be a mess. Dust, gas, noise. But his graph shows a smooth image as if structured. He checks the settings, changes the mode, compares it to reference objects. Turns on filters that usually remove birds, debris, and atmospheric wonders. The reflection doesn't disappear, it just sits there, as if it doesn't care what you do. Normally this would be chalked up to a phantom, but here, two characteristics coincide: stability over time and repeatability over angle. Phantoms don't like discipline. But this reflection is disciplined, almost stubborn. 40 minutes later, a printout marked Radar Anomaly is on his desk, and it doesn't say Active Comet, but rather a dry line. RCS equivalent higher than expected by an order of magnitude. Signature stable. At this point, what would later be called silence begins, not because no one is doing anything, but because everyone is doing too much and simultaneously trying to make it look like nothing is happening. Meanwhile, civilian observatories continue to live their lives. They track the brightness, draw the tail, and debate the jets. Their data is noisy, as a comet should be, and that's precisely why they can easily be used as a curtain. The military, however, sees things differently. Radar doesn't see pretty tails, it doesn't care about aesthetics. It's more important whether an object reflects a signal as a cloud or a shape. And in closed diagrams, this starts to look too much like a shape. The next day, one of the analysts does something simple. He overlays a series of observations. Not photos, not spectra, but radar slices. And he sees that the reflection doesn't drift like a crumbling cloud, but holds steady like a center. The most disturbing thing is that this center exhibits behavior similar to orientation. Sometimes the reflection is slightly enhanced when the object should be turned to face the other side. It's as if it has a side that deliberately reveals itself. A few hours later, a second confirmation appears, from a different country and a different system, an independent radar, a different frequency, different processing. But the picture is essentially the same, a stable signature as if from a solid configuration. When independent systems coincide, everyone gets uneasy, because then you can't just say, your device is acting up. Devices can make mistakes in different ways, but here, they make the same mistakes, and it seems like the truth. Then a reflex kicks in, one that's stronger than curiosity and bureaucracy. Access is cut off, quietly, without any movie-style orders. Some windows are simply temporarily occupied, others under maintenance, and still others, not recommended. On the surface, it seems innocent. Some are told that the runway is occupied by experiments, others that the regime has been changed for safety reasons, and others are given no response at all. The scientists begin to feel a familiar sensation. The wall has gone up, and this is where the first publication hits a wall. The article about 3i/ATLAS's unusual activity, which was supposed to be published as a preprint, is suddenly delayed for review. Formally, everything is fine. In reality, they're stalling. The most disgusting detail is that they're not delaying for a day or a week. They're delaying it until precisely the windows where the object is most visible. It's as if someone is trying to wait out the peak of visibility, only to then say, well, it's too late now. Inside NASA, in a department that doesn't feature in press releases, a short memo appears. It doesn't mention the words aliens or ship. It simply asks, why does radar see structure where optical instruments see dust? This question can't be answered in a single sentence, because if it's a radar error, then it's too smart. If it's a comet, then its body is too confident. If it's something else, then the question becomes dangerous. While those at the top are deciding how to formulate this, those below are trying the simplest thing, rechecking everything on civilian systems, asking ALMA, large dishes, and radio telescopes. But requests suddenly become no-go. They're not officially rejected, they're simply not scheduled. A silence that's not heard, but felt in every unanswered email. That same day, an engineer jokingly says, if it's structure, let it show itself in polarization. The joke gives rise to a problem. They are looking for indirect signs of shape that don't depend on the brightness of the tail. And the more they search, the more the same thing keeps popping up. The object seems to be giving an overly clean response in the ranges where a comet should be dirty and jittery. A signal too neat for a dirty snowball. At some point, a theory emerges that no one is thrilled about. That the object might have a compact part, either shielded or dense, with a coma already dancing around it. That is, dust on the outside and something inside. This theory sounds like a compromise, designed to avoid going crazy. It allows us to simultaneously acknowledge radar without declaring the end of science. But the problem is that the radar signature is too stable even for a dense core. A comet's dense nucleus still rotates, changes its reflection, trembles, heats up, and reacts. But here, the reflection behaves as if the object maintains its orientation relative to the line of sight, at least partially. It's like looking at a spinning rock and suddenly realizing it's spinning, but always facing you at the same angle. Not perfect, not like a mirror, but enough to make you ask bad questions. And it's precisely at this point that the windows are being cut even more. This isn't just a single researcher who wasn't given time at the telescope. Now, entire blocks of schedules are being changed, as if they need to clear the sky, but not for observing. Publicly, all is quiet. Yes, there are occasional surveillance postponements, poor conditions, or technical work. Nothing criminal. But internally, there's a growing feeling that someone is trying to deprive the world of a synchronized picture. Because synchronicity is dangerous. If different instruments simultaneously see the same strange thing, it ceases to be a local problem. It becomes an event that cannot be swept under the rug. And then a new task emerges, no longer scientific but almost tactical. Not to understand what it is, but to prevent everyone from seeing it the same way. To spread it out across time, across frequencies, across interpretations, across versions. Here, simple psychology comes into play. It's easier for different people to argue than to unite. If everyone has their own piece, they'll squabble over methodology, and while they're squabbling, the window of opportunity passes. One group gets good optics, but no radio. Another gets radio, but no radar context. A third sees only what's already processed and smoothed, and almost no one sees the raw image as a whole. The most terrifying thing is that the object seems to play into this disunity. Its activity remains on the edge, noticeable enough to be captivating, but ambiguous enough for everyone to explain it differently. The radar signature doesn't disappear. It simply stops appearing in the windows where civilians can easily confirm it indirectly. It's as if the object is choosing angles where our systems are less compatible. By the evening of December 20th, one of the leaders uttered a phrase that sounded mundane but cut the air. We don't just have an object, we have a protocol for behavior around the object. And this wasn't about the comet anymore. Because a comet doesn't create a protocol. A comet simply flies and melts. A protocol, however, emerges where there's a reaction to the observer, even if that reaction is primitive or automatic. The key question is being put on the table. If military radars see a consistent reflection like from a structure, why haven't we seen the same in open data yet? The answer is unpleasant, because they simply don't make it public. But there's a second, spine-chilling possibility that the object itself can control what it emits. That it can be dusty for optics and hard for radar when it needs to be. The leak didn't start with a photo or a leaked NASA email. It was simpler and dirtier. A single graph, taken on a phone, the screen dimly lit, at an odd angle, and a two-word caption, "This is not a comet." The graph is devoid of beauty. Just a noise shelf, a narrow peak, then a second one, and next to it, a mark that makes experienced users' jaws ache. The phase stability is maintained in bursts, as if the signal is tied to a structure. This image lives for exactly 20 minutes, then it disappears from everywhere. Not because of moderation, but because the real purge has begun. Links disappear, accounts are banned. Reposts vanish. The very fact of such speed is more frightening than the content. If it were fake, it would have been laughed at. If it were just noise, it would have been ignored. But here they treated it as if it were something that shouldn't be left in the light. In an hour, the hunt begins. Not in the movie sense, where people in glasses run through the hallways. It's a quiet hunt. Log requests. MAC address matches, login checks, friendly conversations. The man who took the photo isn't a hero or a spy. He was simply tired of hearing nothing unusual when the system had been in danger for a long time, and he decided the world needed to see at least a piece of it. The problem is that the piece turned out to be too precise. It has something a comet shouldn't have. A repeatable response pattern that doesn't break up with changes in angle and range. At the same time, analysts are trying to piece together the overall picture through closed channels, and they see a strange coincidence. The bursts of structural reflection are not random, but rather in series, as if the object is turning on and off. Someone says, maybe it's rotation. The idea sounds reassuring until a detail emerges. The series match their duration almost perfectly, even when the observation geometry changes. If it's rotation, it's too smooth. If it's a response to heat, it's too synchronous. If it's a machine, it operates on a schedule that doesn't seem random. That's when the word no one wants to say out loud appears, barcode. Because when the series were superimposed, a pattern emerged on the time axis. A short pulse, a pause, a long one, a pause, two short ones. This isn't a single peak or interference. It's a sequence. And the most annoying thing is that it repeats at regular intervals, as if the object were emitting the same signature over and over again. In conventional radar, this happens when the reflection comes from a regular shape, from a truss, from a rib, from a section, from anything with a repeating step. A dust coma has no step. Dust doesn't build a staircase of impulses, dust makes mush, and then the mush suddenly shows a rhythm, like a heart on a cardiogram, only cold and mechanical. By this point, the people at the top no longer ask, "What is it?" They ask, "Who else knows?" Because the second fear is always stronger than the first. If it's real, it's scary. If many people know it, it can't be contained. And then they introduce a strange rule. All raw radar data is put on hold. Not forever, for hours, but precisely for those hours when the object is expected to give a strong response again. The explanation sounds elegant. Calibration, artifact correction, metadata alignment. In reality, it's simply a valve that closes when the pressure becomes too pronounced. On the same day, a new reassurance report is published externally. The phrases are the same, just different. Everything is within normal limits, the object is interesting, but it's just a comet. And here's where the twist comes in, one that many miss. Military radars aren't required to look at the comet at all. They don't need to be interested. If they do, it means there was a trigger. The trigger wasn't the proximity, the trigger was the signature. Their recognition system detects a similarity to an artificial object. It may not be precise, it may be questionable, but it's enough to raise a flag. And once the flag is raised, protocols that don't like publicity are activated. Because any what-if analysis immediately intrudes into areas of responsibility, budgets, and security. On the third day, an engineer with a still-living sense of humor performs a simple test. He looks not at the amplitude, but at the polarization of the reflection. Polarization for dust usually fluctuates like the wind. For shape, it holds steady. And with 3I/ATLAS, it holds too firmly in those series where the barcode is most pronounced. This doesn't prove it's a ship, but it does kill the comfortable. It's just a cloud theory. Because a cloud can't maintain its response orientation so reliably, the next step is even worse. They try to check the Doppler structure of the pulses. If it's a reflection from the shape, the Doppler should show cross-sections associated with the movement of the parts relative to the beam, and the Doppler shows hints of two modes. One is wide, as if from scattering, the other is narrow, as if from a compact part. And these modes are activated in the same sequence, so the barcode lives not only in time, it lives in the physics of the signal. It's as if the object alternately reveals different elements or unfolds something inside. There's no time for theories about ice pockets here. Ice doesn't unfold elements. Ice doesn't switch reflection modes at regular intervals. One of the analysts loses his nerve and writes in his notes a phrase that will later be quoted in whispers. We are observing behavior, not just material. This formulation is dangerous because it changes the framework. Material can be explained by chemistry. Behavior requires a motive or an algorithm, and an algorithm, even a dumb one, already makes the object a subject. At this point, a proposal comes through secure channels. We need to compare it with military object catalogs. That is, to check whether the signature matches known devices or junk. The answer comes quickly and coldly. It doesn't match, and that's not a joy, because a match would mean an earthly nature. A non-coincidence opens a door where no one wants to go. To close this door, they're making the most bureaucratic move possible. They're changing the dictionary. From now on, documents will no longer refer to structure, but rather anomalous scattering cross-section. The words are longer, the meaning is the same, but they sound less scary. That's how defensive speech works. It doesn't explain, it numbs. At the same time, another small detail is happening, which will later lead to the main horror. At one station, a microfrequency shift is detected that coincides with the end of the barcode. It looks like the object not only reflects, but also slightly influences the received signal. Not much, just marginally, but repeatable. The immediate theory that comes to mind is a plasma influence. Beautiful, scientific, convenient. Only plasma usually wreaks havoc, and here again, a neat repetition. This means that if it's environmental influence, then the environment is being formed in a controlled manner. And this is where the thought becomes unpleasant even for a skeptic. If an object can create a structure around itself that behaves identically under different conditions, it already resembles a tool, a shell, a screen, an active skin. And then it becomes clear why access is being cut off. Because if civilian radio telescopes independently confirm this, everything will explode. Then the questions begin. Why is there a normal glitch at some hours, while at others there are closed windows? Why is some data delayed but precisely at the peak? Why does the reflection repeat in series, as if with a marker? And why did all this coincide with the most convenient time for observations, when the planet could see the object properly for the first time, and not in fragments? At the end of December 20th, one of the managers made a decision that smacked of panic to switch some stations to active radiation minimization mode. That is, shine less light on the target, probe less, run less risk of them responding with something that can't be hidden with any press releases. Formally, this is called load reduction. Unofficially, it sounds different. Don't provoke. And this word makes the atmosphere tense, because don't provoke isn't applied to a piece of ice, but to something that can react. Against this backdrop, citizen astronomers continue to debate tails and jets. They're unaware that somewhere nearby, a different debate is already underway, whether it's even worthwhile to continue shining radar at the object. Because if the barcode isn't just a reflection, but a signature, then the next step is obvious. Check whether it's a message. And if this is a message, the question becomes the simplest and most terrible. To whom is it addressed? The decision to keep it low held until one of the duty officers saw the object re-entering ideal geometry. The one where the signal should be clear and the reflection strong, and where it's easiest to chalk it up to interference if you get there first. The station wasn't the main one, nor was it a media outlet. It was just a regular radar station, the kind no one ever shows on the news, but relied on when they needed to know the truth before it became a headline. And there was a man there who couldn't stand anything left unsaid. He saw the barcode yesterday. He saw it removed from the reporting system. He saw the order come from above to reduce activity, and he realized something simple. If they remain silent again today, tomorrow might be too late for any honest measurements. The request for a full run was sent up twice. The first time, it was ignored. The second time, it was returned with the dry phrase, "not required." But orders have a weak point. They are always designed to instill discipline, not stubbornness. He activated a mode that, on paper, is called a calibration test pulse. It sounds so dull that it doesn't raise any suspicions in the reports. In reality, it was the densest and cleanest packet the station could produce in a short window, and the moment the antenna settled on the calculated azimuth, the room went silent. It wasn't because someone said, "attention," it was just that even the fan suddenly started to sound louder than usual. The first impulse passed. On the screen where the usual mess appeared, a smooth, neat mirror appeared. Too neat, not like a cloud, like a facet, like a surface that knows how to reflect. The second transmission produced the same result, but with a detail that made the duty officer's fingers go cold. The reflection didn't just return, it returned with a rhythm that matched the barcode, only now it was not in noise, but in a pure signal. The third pulse made things worse. For a split second, double vision appeared on the screen, as if the signal had been reflected off two objects located almost next to each other. Not dust fragments, not a coma, but two compact dots with different phases. He recalculated the delay. The difference was small but consistent, enough to tell that this wasn't a one-time artifact. It was a structure with two dominant reflective elements, and then something happened that was unthinkable from a dead stone. After the fourth pulse, a response appeared in the receiving line that shouldn't have been there. It was very weak, bordering on sensitivity, but with precise regularity. It wasn't a reflection. It was like interference with the channel, as if someone had adjusted the phase slightly so that a pattern emerged on the reception. The duty officer didn't say a word. He simply did the only right thing in the situation. He repeated the test, changing the frequency within the acceptable range. If it was interference, it would behave differently. If it was the environment, the effect would spread. The effect didn't spread. It moved. Just like a mark moves if the source understands where you've moved. And that was the worst part, because at that moment you stop arguing about the nature of the signal. You start arguing with the word reaction itself. Reaction means feedback, and feedback in space almost always means control. He did one more thing that would never be forgiven. He increased the power, not to the maximum, so as not to leave a trace in the logs, but one step above, safe. Just enough to draw the answer out of the shadows. And the answer came. A short packet appeared on the screen that didn't match any known type of interference. It was too smooth in structure, too clean in spectrum, and too repetitive in pauses. It was as if the object wasn't simply reflecting whatever was shining into it, but was returning an ordered pattern on top of the reflection, like a marking. Like a signature that could only be seen if you looked at it correctly. The duty officer stopped the run and copied the raw data into a separate container, not over the network, to a drive, the old-fashioned way, which doesn't like logging. He knew that if it went into the system, it would disappear before he could blink. At the same time, he opened a second monitor with a closed catalog of observations from other stations, and he discovered a coincidence that made him want to curse. At the same hour, another radar experienced a time synchronization failure, so they weren't the only ones who noticed the oddity. It's just that others had already labeled it a clock error. Then he performed one final check, the simplest and most ruthless. He superimposed the response packet on the very same barcode from the leak they'd cleaned up yesterday. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close. It was as if the barcode had been a low-quality shadow, and now he'd received the same thing, only without the noise. And that meant the leak was real, and it also meant that yesterday they weren't cleaning up a fake. They were cleaning up a warning. He didn't send the data to his superiors. He sent it to a specific person, someone who doesn't like fancy words and can read a spectrum the way others read text. The message was short. Look at the phase. It's not a reflection. The answer came 8 minutes later, which in itself was a worrying sign. I see. It looks like an overlay, like an active beacon. Do you understand that? The duty officer understood, and that's precisely why he didn't want to answer, because an active beacon changes the entire scenario. It's no longer a question of what's inside the comet, it's a question of what's it doing near Earth, and why now, when it's best to observe it. Then came what always happens when a system encounters something that doesn't fit into the report. First, an attempt to label it with a familiar name, then an attempt to hide it, then an attempt to agree among themselves that everyone saw something different. An order came from above to close the observation window for 2 hours, as a precaution. Close it precisely when the object was supposed to pass through the ideal angle again, for repeating the experiment. It didn't look like caution, it looked like a fear of repetition. That same evening, a new analysis suddenly appeared in public sources. All radar reflections from comets are unstable and dependent on plasma. The text was smooth, correct, and too fast. He didn't explain the observation. He warned the public in advance that what they might hear tomorrow had already been explained. It was an attempt to put the lid on the pot before it boiled. But the lid is held together only by silence. And the silence cracked when one of the civilian radio amateurs, working on reception rather than transmission, posted a strange recording. He wasn't sending out pulses. He was simply listening. And a rhythm emerged in his noise too. The same rhythm that moves with the frequency. As if someone was illuminating a channel not just for the military, but for the surrounding space in general. And then, the most unpleasant thing happened for those trying to close the case. 2 independent, unrelated groups saw the same pattern at the same time, without a common methodology or shared equipment. From that moment on, the word interference began to sound like a mockery. Interference doesn't synchronize across the planet so beautifully, but a beacon can. Especially if it's not out there, but nearby, on a trajectory that gives it a good view. In a closed-door meeting last night, someone uttered a phrase that would later be remembered as the point of no return. If this is a beacon, it might not be for us. And silence fell over the room, because the meaning of this phrase is simple and very unpleasant. The object can mark an area, it can scan, it can transmit the mark into the space where it is expected. And then everyone suddenly remembered how carefully, after December 21st, the trajectory had become like a perimeter flyby, as if it weren't flying past but following the lines, covering sector after sector, as if he has a task, to assemble the painting, or mark it, or leave a mark on it. At that hour, the Earth appeared calm only in the news image. Inside the monitoring networks, everything trembled with small surges, as if the planet were listening and responding. It wasn't astronomers who noticed this first. It was people who live by numbers and graphs and dislike mysticism. Seismologists, meteorologists, and ionospheric station operators. Each of them had their own little thing. A slight shift, a brief anomaly, no reason to panic, until someone put them all on the same timeline, and that's when things got nasty. The peaks occurred almost simultaneously, not daily, not weekly average, at the same hour, on different continents, in different data types. The problem isn't even that the Earth sometimes makes noise. The problem is that it rarely makes noise beautifully, and this one felt like an alien discipline, not like nature. At that same hour, 3I/ATLAS performed its jet trick again. The direction changed in steps, with pauses, as if someone were switching modes, rather than gusts tearing dust in different directions. If you watched it like a movie, it would all seem too straightforward. The object scans, the Earth responds. Military radars pick up the signature, and someone from above asks everyone to remain silent. But in reality, the scary thing is that everything happens in pieces. Each specialist sees only their own fragment, and everyone doubts it until a timing coincidence appears. On NASA's closed channels that evening, the same phrase was circulating, spoken by different voices. We're not discussing causality, we're discussing correlation. It sounds cautious. In reality, it means no one wants to be the first to say out loud that the connection might not be coincidental, because then they'll have to answer. At the same time, a quiet war for the observing window began at the observatories. Some demanded more time on the object, while others said, "Don't touch it, it's unstable." Unstable? Yes. But strangely, its instability was repetitive. Repetition is what kills the chaos theory. The most disturbing thing was that the jet pattern matched the perimeter flyby. It was as if the trajectory and activity were 2 layers of the same plane. When the object passed a certain sector of the sky, the jet changed angle. When it exited the sector, there was a pause. Another sector, another step. It's like an unfolding pattern. An algorithm that covers an area without holes. This isn't how stones work. This is how systems that need a map work. And then the military entered the conversation, not through radar, but through the ionosphere, because at the same hour the radar picked up the marker, strange dips began to appear in the low frequencies. Not just interference. Gaps of equal duration and equal intervals, as if someone had created windows of silence in the airwaves. This is an important detail that's easy to miss. The ionosphere doesn't respect schedules, it's capricious, and then suddenly it became punctual. One analyst wrote a phrase in a report that was quickly deleted. Looks like synchronization with an external source. It was replaced with a safer warning. Possible influence of solar activity. Only the sun was calmer than predicted during those hours. And then someone did what they always do in these kinds of situations when they don't want to utter the dreaded word. They started cutting off access to the data for security reasons. First, they blocked radar data. Then they delayed publication of spectra. Then they temporarily restricted online access to telemetry from several ground-based networks. It looked like a concern for order, but the order was strange. They covered up precisely those pieces that fit together to form the overall picture. The most ironic thing is that civilian astronomy continued to go about its business as usual. People posted photos of the comet, discussed its tail, and rejoiced at the rare visitor. But inside the closed rooms, the tone was different. There, they weren't discussing whether a coma was beautiful. They were discussing why the reflection seemed to be held in a rigid form. By morning, a new problem had emerged. Several stations in different countries reported a firmware update to their equipment. Too timely, on the same day, in the same period. Coincidences happen, but they don't like to be global and synchronous. It was then that one of the engineers said the most human and most accurate thing. If we do nothing, why do our systems behave as if we are at war? No one responded to this, because the answer was obvious and unpleasant. Someone decided that the information was more dangerous than the object. At that moment, Hubble entered history, not in the form of beautiful photographs, but as a symbol. A large, old, legendary telescope that accidentally went into safe mode, right at the key window. Officially, it was simply a routine glitch, safety first. But to the specialists, it sounded different. Safe mode doesn't just appear out of thin air at the perfect moment. It's either triggered by a set of conditions, or it detects something the system deems a threat. And this is where telemetry became more important than images, because it shows not just pretty things, but honestly, which sensors were triggered, and what exactly was considered dangerous. The problem was in the pattern. The triggering didn't look like a single overheating or a random glitch. It looked like a series of short-load pulses. Pulses that were timed closely to the radar response packet. Too close to be just an unpleasant coincidence. Someone on the call quietly said, if it's electromagnetic interference, it doesn't have to be strong. It just needs to be precise. This phrase comes from the world of electronic attacks, not comets, and that's why it struck a chord with anyone who still clung to natural nature. Then everything followed the bureaucratic script. A commission was created, responsible persons were appointed, public statements were prepared. And at the same time, they tacitly prohibited discussing the key question. Why do independent tools see the same thing at the same time? Because it breaks down the beloved defense. When everything can be blamed on a specific device, you can argue endlessly. When everyone can see, arguing is impossible. Meanwhile, 3i/ATLAS continued to comb space. With each cycle, it grew not more frightening, but clearer. What's scary isn't that it makes noise. What's scary is that it does it as a system, with modes, pauses, repetitions, and corrections. And then a detail emerged that literally made some people's eyes hurt from lack of sleep. The patterns of the jets began to match the windows when the Earth was better heard. It sounds strange until you explain it simply. There's an observational geometry where the planet acts as a bright target for the object. And it was precisely in these areas that the activity seemed most careful, as if he was choosing the moments when he would receive the maximum response. At a private level, this was no longer called a jet or a tail, it was called an interaction mode. Words are important. They show that people inside have stopped thinking of this as just a comet, even if they continue to smile on the outside. At some point, one of the analysts proposed a hypothesis that made things even worse for everyone. What if the radar response isn't for us, but for his network? If an object returns a packet via reflection, it may be marking space, rather than communicating. This is more like a navigational cue than a message, and then, flying around the perimeter ceases to be an aesthetic matter. It becomes a procedure, a marking, a check. No one wanted to say out loud what exactly they were testing, but everyone understood that the options weren't encouraging. Either he's studying us as a surveillance target, in which case it's reconnaissance, or he's studying us as a target, in which case it's a test, or he's marking us for someone else. The worst thing is that these options are not mutually exclusive. At the end of that day, one man, who in the morning had considered this beautiful astronomy, uttered a phrase he would never forget. If it's a comet, why is it acting like a protocol? Exactly, like a protocol, with steps, windows, reactions, and a channel signature. The next day it became clear, safe mode on Hubble wasn't a blip, but the first setback. Afterward, it wasn't the telescopes that started failing, but the access. And that's always worse, because hardware breaks accidentally, while access is intentionally disrupted. At first, it all seemed almost comical. Several observatories received letters with updated publication rules. Formally, it was about calibration, quality, and artifact checking. In reality, it added one new line. All three I/ATLAS frames must first be approved. Some might say, logical, the object is noisy, we don't want fakes. The problem is different. Coordination was introduced precisely when independent instruments first began to coincide in time. That is, not to avoid mistakes, but to prevent them from coinciding again. There's an unspoken magic within the scientific community. If you want a topic to die, don't ban it outright. Make publishing slow, stressful, and risky. People will stop wasting their time because their grants, papers, and careers are on fire. And then came the strange restrictions on imaging. Not a ban, but a prioritization. Some telescopes suddenly had their windows cut. Others, on the contrary, were given some, but in a spectral band where the main anomaly was less obvious. This isn't a conspiracy theory on the level of posters. It's bureaucracy. It knows how to hide meaning in schedules, filters, and wording. In the world of science, a schedule sometimes speaks louder than any order. The most disturbing thing happened when an archival photo surfaced in the rough cuts. Not a new shot, but an old, well-known one, just in its raw form, and in it the jet streams looked different than in the official version. The difference wasn't like in beauty or contrast, it was in geometry. In the raw version, the pattern was more regular, almost mechanical. In the published version, it looked more natural, more diffuse, more easily explained. This is the moment when people's cold fear kicks in, because calibration error can be corrected, but correcting the meaning cannot. If someone edits a picture so it says less, it means someone else has already realized it says too much. The official line sounded as perfect as ever, bringing to a single processing standard, and that's precisely what's most infuriating, because standardized processing is usually done before publication, not after independent signals coincide within the same hour. At the same time, military channels began acting as if they had acquired a second object. The reports included the phrase, a persistent reflectivity component, that persisted even when the dust cloud should have logically exploded and dissipated. If you've ever seen radar reports, you know there's no emotion. There's no scary. There are only stable, repeatable, signature. And when the word signature is repeated too often, it means someone is already drawing the contours. A simple thing was being discussed within a private chat. A comet's reflection should be capricious. It depends heavily on the angle, the dust density, and how the tail is swept by the solar wind. But here, the component was consistent, as if it were reflecting not a cloud, but a surface that maintains its orientation, a surface that can provide a stable response. It's not necessarily a panel or a slab, but it's no longer fluffy dust, and against this backdrop, Hubble remained silent. It had been a symbol of confidence for decades, but now it had retreated into silence just for the moment, leaving everyone with the feeling that someone had turned off the lights in the room the moment they entered. It's important to understand why safe mode is so mind-blowing for those in the know. Hubble doesn't just break gracefully. Its safety mode activates when the system detects a risk to itself. Risk to power, to orientation, to the reaction of the flywheels, to the sensors. If telemetry shows pulse loads, it means he's not just tired. He felt something similar to an external stimulus, brief, precise, and at the moment of observation, and then comes the most unpleasant thought, the one no one likes. If an object can disturb a telescope in orbit, even indirectly, it can also disturb something else. Not destroy it, move it, knock it down. Jerk the system for a second. That same day, one of the ground-based systems reported an unexpected drift in its guidance. Not a disaster, not an accident. Simply a brief azimuth shift that coincided with the next step of the jets. Another coincidence, another hour, and another attempt to pretend it was a normal mechanical, wind, or temperature issue. And then someone compiled it all into a single table. Wind, temperature, tracking errors, dips in the radio range, seismic bursts, radar packets, jet streams. And they saw something that shouldn't exist in living nature. A uniform tempo. Too smooth. Too clean. Nature loves noise, and here the noise seems to be subordinated to a grid. This creates the sensation of flying around the perimeter. Not a rendezvous, but a circuit. Not a random line, but a route that selects locations where the Earth is most suitable as a target, for photography, for radar, for passive listening. And now a third layer is added. Not only does the object choose a route, but we ourselves begin to change our behavior around it. We close windows, delay publications, edit images, and reprioritize observations. It's a subtle point, but it's crucial. If an object truly scans, the system's response to the scan becomes part of the data. It may not read our words. It's enough to read our silence. You may not believe its reason, but as an automatic protocol, it sounds even worse, because the protocol doesn't need emotions. It needs a response, and it gets a response when we start hiding. At one point during one of the calls, a phrase was uttered that suddenly made everyone in the room feel cramped. We're acting like we're being tested, and it's already evident in our actions. After that, we decided to do two things. First, publicly, continue to say, a comet, a rare visitor, everything is under control. Second, truly, create a parallel data loop that won't be archived publicly. That's how the Gray Archive came about. Not secret like in a movie, just scattered copies held by people who don't trust a single storage point. Because if someone has already standardized an image so it says less, they'll do it again. And this is where the story takes a turn that officials usually dislike, because the Gray Archive creates the risk of a leak. And a leak isn't dangerous because people will learn something terrible. It's dangerous because independent amateurs will start making comparisons. And amateurs today aren't just old men with trumpets. They're networks of telescopes, algorithms, thousands of hours of observations. They're a collective radar that can't be shut down with a single command. That evening, someone from that circle posted a short piece. Not a still image, not a video, but a graph. Simple, boring, and emotionless. It included timestamps and the direction of the stream. And the repetition of steps. The graph didn't explode because it was pretty. It exploded because it was clear. Even a non-physicist could see that this didn't look like a coincidence. 2 hours later, the post disappeared. 4 hours later, the account was banned. A day later, explanations began appearing as to why the timeline was incorrect. This already looked like a system in panic, trying to regain control of history, because it was at this moment that we first saw the true front line. Not between scientists and conspiracy theorists, but between open data and manipulated imagery. And against this backdrop, 3i/ATLAS continued to do its thing. Step, pause, step, as if it didn't care whether we believed it or not. As if it was working not for our impression, but for the result. The scariest thing is that in the next cycle, he began to change not only the direction, but also the duration of the pause. A small thing. Yes, but this no longer resembles a deployment, but rather adaptation. If the pause increases when the data is closed and decreases when someone starts observing again, this means the subject is sensing the environment. And then, our fear turns into a signal, and here comes the next blow. During one of these cycles, military radars receive a reflection that in phase appears to be clean, not diffuse. As if it were shaped, and at that very same hour, access to several observatory streams in the open channels is again accidentally lost. Again, at the window. Again, right where a coincidence could have become proof. There were no loud headlines or sirens that night. It was worse. It felt like someone was carefully removing the batteries from the world, and you could hear the silence becoming too even to be a coincidence. The Gray Archive thrived on the paranoid habit of duplicating everything. One file on the laptop in the office, a second on the home NAS, a third with a colleague in another country, a fourth in a chat that no one considers important. It was this unimportant chat that saved everything, because the official channel's stream suddenly dropped for exactly 1 minute, while the amateurs continued recording. Different networks, different providers, different countries. It was just the timing. If it had been a simple loss of connection, it would have been a blur. First one went down, then another, then a third. But this was a synchronous failure, as if someone had pressed a single button on a remote control that shouldn't exist. And this is what made it into the Gray Archive. Not a sensational shot or a glowing plate. It was a boring collection of dots against a background. But the dots formed a line, and the line was too clever. The trajectory after December 21st ceased to be a pass-by trajectory. It became a circle-around trajectory. And not along a graceful arc, but along the contour of the zone where the Earth is most suitable for radar and passive imaging from orbit. A person looking at the sky expects chaos. A comet, a tail, solar wind pressure, a slight tremor. But when the line behaves like a drone's route, the brain switches to a different mode. The Gray Archive revealed one thing that the official reports didn't like to show alongside each other. The navigation layer and the activity layer coincided. The jets weren't just moving, they were marking points along the way. There were steps, even like a metronome. Turn, pause, turn. and each turn coincided with the object passing through yet another convenient geometry relative to the Earth and the Sun. If this is a sweep, then it's a sweep of something specific. Not space in general, but our node. The Earth, the magnetosphere, radio noise, the density of the upper atmosphere. Everything that can be measured from afar. The most annoying part was the pauses. Before, they were almost identical, but now they began to adjust. When the data stream was closed, the pause grew longer. When someone looked again, the pause shortened. It sounds mystical until you see the chart. There's no mysticalness in the chart, just timestamps. And when the stamps line up, you're left with two options: deny or accept. A new vocabulary has emerged within NASA these days. You won't find it in a press release. Risk contour, narrative management, minimizing secondary effects. They weren't talking about the facility, but about us. Because the main fear wasn't that the object was unusual. The main fear was that it could trigger a chain reaction. A slight jolt in a system already strained would be enough, and then strange things began to happen on Earth. At first, they were attributed to the season, the climate, and mere statistics. But coincidences began to stick so tightly to the dates of the convergences that it began to seem obscene. Storm warnings in normally calm areas. Power grids, acting as if someone had shaken their frequency. And earthquakes that aren't major, but are too synchronous. Important. No one said, "It's a comet." Inside, no one wanted to utter such a phrase, but graphs were laid out on the table, showing the peak of interference coinciding with the next step of the jets. And that was enough. There's an unpleasant truth about our planet. It's big, but sensitive. The magnetosphere, the ionosphere, tidal effects, resonances. We're used to thinking of this as background noise, but you can touch the background if you know how. A textbook comet doesn't have the ability to touch the background. It flies and evaporates. But if the object has highly focused jets acting as a controlled plasma flow, the picture changes. A death ray isn't necessary. It's enough for it to create persistent interference in the desired band. It's enough for it to nudge the ionosphere like a finger tugging on a string until it starts to ring louder. And that's exactly what the first reports from radio engineers looked like. Repeated disturbances, short bursts, a clear interval. This is the language of people who don't believe in fairy tales and don't like coincidences. And then, something happened that finally shattered the credibility of the just a comet theory. Military radars detected a reflection that held together like a structure, a stable component like a shape, not dust. And right after that, silence fell. Not a loud silence, but a practical one. Observation windows were shortened, publications were delayed, several groups were recommended not to raise the issue without verification. But the Gray Archive had already taken on a life of its own, and another connection had appeared. When the radars picked up the structure, the jets behaved differently. It was as if the object had switched to a different operating mode, more economical and precise. Those who understand the equipment immediately ran into a simple question. Why change the mode precisely when you're being watched by radar? If you're a stone, you don't care. If you're a system, you react. That night, there was a moment in the recording when the jet appears to take a short step, almost like a marker. At the same moment, a jump in one of the radio bands used by long-range radars is detected on Earth. People argued about how to connect the two. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was solar activity. But solar activity doesn't adjust to the step interval, while here the interval was kept like a schedule. And here, suddenly, flying around the perimeter ceased to be a metaphor. On the Gray Archive map, the active steps points formed a circle that encircled the Earth, not by distance, but by visibility angles. It seemed as if the object was choosing not where it was closer, but where it was better, where the reflection was greatest, where the radio was loudest, where our planet revealed itself as a target for measurement. You can call it reconnaissance, you can call it calibration, you can call it scanning, as we discussed earlier. But whatever you call it, the meaning is the same. It's working according to plan. And when you have a plan of the facility on one picture, and our reaction in the form of closures, safe mode, delays on the other, you suddenly realize that we too have become part of the experiment. Not because we were deceived, but because we are predictable. We hide what we fear, we close windows when we are unsure, we hold back data when we fear panic. And if someone can read the system, they don't need our words. They just need to see where the world goes blind. Blindness is a marker, as convenient for analysis as any radar blip. At one meeting, the following was said: if this is a scan, then the next step will be a reaction test. Not of Earth as a planet, the reactions of people as a control system, and then they made the mistake that those who try to control history almost always make. They decided to play into complete silence, immediately, abruptly, synchronously, on a global scale. That same night, several observation streams disappeared almost simultaneously, and the Gray Archive once again preserved the trail. because the amateur stations hadn't signed the agreements or read the updated rules. And there, in the amateur data, the most frightening thing happened. The object changed its pattern. It took a step at an unusual interval. It took one step at a time, as if in a hurry, as if checking to see if anyone would notice. This was the first time adaptation looked not like statistics, but like behavior. Short, sharp, a response to our blindness, as if he saw that we had closed in, and decided to speed it up.